Have you ever wondered why some men seem to shut down emotionally when you try to connect with them? Why do they pull away, become distant, or simply ignore you when you're reaching out? Today, we're diving deep into Carl Jung's revolutionary psychological insights to uncover the hidden weakness behind this frustrating male behavior. Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who gave us concepts like the collective unconscious and psychological types, had profound insights about human relationships and the shadow aspects of our personalities. What he discovered about men who ignore women will fundamentally change how you understand their behavior, and more importantly, how you respond to it. The man who ignores you isn't displaying strength. He's revealing his greatest psychological weakness. And once you understand this weakness through Jung's lens, you'll never see dismissive behavior the same way again. Before we begin this transformative journey into the male psyche, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We explore the depths of human psychology every week, giving you insights that can revolutionize your relationships and personal growth. Jung believed that every behavior, especially defensive ones, stems from unconscious fears and unresolved psychological conflicts. When a man ignores you, he's not just being rude or indifferent. He's unconsciously protecting himself from something that terrifies him more than you might realize. The greatest weakness of a man who ignores you is his inability to integrate his anima, what Jung called the feminine aspect within every man's psyche. This anima represents emotional depth, intuition, creativity, and the capacity for meaningful connection. When a man hasn't developed a healthy relationship with his inner feminine, he becomes threatened by real women who embody these qualities. Think about it. When you approach him with emotional authenticity, vulnerability, or a desire for deeper connection, you're essentially holding up a mirror to the parts of himself he's been rejecting. Your presence activates his underdeveloped anima, creating internal chaos he doesn't know how to handle. So he does what feels safest. He shuts down, withdraws, or ignores you entirely. This isn't conscious behavior. Most men don't wake up thinking, "I'm going to ignore her because she triggers my unintegrated feminine side." Instead, they experience an uncomfortable internal pressure, a sense of being overwhelmed or invaded, and their primitive defense mechanism kicks in: avoidance. Jung taught us that what we resist in others often represents what we've rejected in ourselves. When a man consistently ignores women who seek emotional connection, he's running from his own capacity for depth and intimacy. This creates what Jung called a shadow projection. He sees in you the very qualities he's afraid to acknowledge within himself. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, contains all the aspects of our personality that we've deemed unacceptable or threatening. For many men raised in societies that equate masculinity with emotional stoicism, their natural capacity for feeling, intuition, and vulnerability gets pushed into the shadow realm. When you show up authentically, expressing these very qualities, you become a walking reminder of everything he's been taught to suppress. This is why his ignoring behavior often feels so charged with emotion, even though he appears cold or indifferent. Beneath that apparent calm lies a storm of internal conflict. Part of him is deeply drawn to the emotional authenticity you represent, while another part is terrified of what embracing those qualities might mean for his sense of masculine identity. Jung observed that men who haven't integrated their anima often oscillate between two extremes. They either become overly dependent on women to provide all their emotional processing, or they reject feminine energy entirely. The man who ignores you has chosen the latter path, but it comes at a tremendous psychological cost. Consider how exhausting it must be to constantly monitor and suppress natural human impulses toward connection and emotional expression. Every time you reach out to him, every moment of warmth or vulnerability you offer, he has to consciously or unconsciously decide to resist it. This constant internal battle drains his psychological energy and keeps him trapped in a limited version of himself. The tragedy is that by rejecting you, he's also rejecting the parts of himself that could lead to his greatest growth and fulfillment. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires integrating all aspects of our psyche, including those we find uncomfortable or challenging. What makes this particularly painful for women is that you often sense the potential in these men. You can feel the depth they're hiding, the emotional capacity they're denying. You might find yourself trying harder, being more patient, or attempting different approaches to break through their defenses. But here's what Jung would tell you. You cannot do the inner work for another person. The man who ignores you is revealing that he hasn't yet developed the psychological maturity to handle authentic human connection. His weakness isn't in his inability to love you. It's in his inability to love and accept the fullness of himself. What Jung discovered about the masculine psyche reveals something profound. The men who ignore you most consistently are often the ones who need emotional connection the most. Their dismissive behavior isn't evidence of independence or strength. It's a desperate attempt to maintain control over internal forces they don't understand. Jung identified 4 primary psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. In our culture, men are often encouraged to develop their thinking and sensation functions while neglecting feeling and intuition. This creates what Jung called a one-sided development that leaves them psychologically incomplete and, paradoxically, more vulnerable than they appear. When you approach such a man with emotional intelligence, intuitive insights, or a desire for heartfelt communication, you're essentially speaking in a language he never learned to understand. More threatening still, you're demonstrating capacities he's been told he shouldn't possess or value. This creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension between conflicting beliefs or experiences. The man who ignores you is caught in a psychological double-bind. His conscious mind might tell him that emotions are weakness, that vulnerability is dangerous, and that maintaining distance equals maintaining power. But his unconscious psyche is drawn to the very qualities you embody. This internal war manifests as the cold, dismissive behavior you experience. Jung taught that we often fear most what we need most for our psychological development. The man who ignores your emotional overtures is usually the same man who feels most isolated, most disconnected from his own inner life, and most starved for the kind of authentic connection you're offering. But here's where it gets interesting from a Jungian perspective. His resistance to you is actually his psyche's way of protecting him from a transformation he's not ready to undergo. Accepting your emotional invitation would require him to question fundamental assumptions about himself and his place in the world. It would mean acknowledging that his current way of being is incomplete. This is why logic rarely works with such men. You can't think your way through an emotional and psychological barrier. His ignoring behavior isn't a rational response to a logical problem. It's an unconscious defense against psychological material he's not equipped to process. Jung observed that meaningful psychological change often requires what he called a sacrifice of the ego. The man would need to surrender his current identity, the strong, unfeeling, independent masculine ideal, to embrace a more integrated version of himself. For many men, this feels like psychological death, even though it would actually lead to psychological rebirth. Understanding this doesn't excuse his behavior, but it does explain it. And more importantly, it reveals why your typical responses, trying harder, being more understanding, or attempting to prove your worth, are fundamentally misguided strategies. One of Jung's most brilliant insights was his understanding of psychological projection, how we unconsciously attribute our own rejected qualities to others. When a man ignores you, he's often projecting his own feared emotional nature onto you, then rejecting you as a way of rejecting those aspects within himself. This creates a particularly cruel dynamic. The very qualities that make you attractive to his unconscious mind, your emotional intelligence, your capacity for vulnerability, your desire for authentic connection, become the reasons his conscious mind finds to dismiss you. He might label you as too emotional, needy, or dramatic, when in reality, you're simply embodying the psychological wholeness he lacks. Before we dive into this, if you're still with me, please comment with the number 1 if these insights are resonating with you. Jung called this phenomenon anima projection. The man projects his underdeveloped feminine side onto you, then either idealizes you unrealistically or devalues you completely. In the case of the man who ignores you, he's chosen devaluation as his defense mechanism. By making you the problem, he avoids confronting his own psychological incompleteness. What's particularly insidious about this dynamic is how it can make you question your own reality. When someone consistently ignores or dismisses your emotional needs, you might start wondering if you really are too much, or if your desire for connection is somehow inappropriate. This is psychological gaslighting, even when it's not intentionally malicious. Jung would remind you that a psychologically healthy person doesn't need to shut down others to maintain their own sense of stability. A man who has integrated his anima, who has developed a healthy relationship with his own emotional and intuitive capacities, doesn't feel threatened by women who embody these qualities. Instead, he recognizes and appreciates them. The man who ignores you is essentially telling you that your psychological wholeness threatens his psychological fragmentation. This says nothing about your worth and everything about his developmental stage. You're not too much. He's simply not enough psychologically speaking. This understanding can be both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because it frees you from the exhausting cycle of trying to prove your worth to someone who is fundamentally unable to recognize it. Heartbreaking because it reveals the tragic waste of human potential, both his and yours, that occurs when two people are operating from such different levels of psychological development. Jung believed that we attract people who mirror our own psychological material, but sometimes we attract them precisely because we represent what they need for growth, even if they're not ready to embrace that growth. Your presence in his life might be his psyche's attempt to heal itself, but his ego's resistance creates the painful dynamic you experience. The key insight here is that his inability to receive what you offer isn't a reflection of your inadequacy. It's a reflection of his psychological limitations. Understanding this can help you stop taking his behavior personally and start making decisions based on your own needs rather than his deficits. Jung understood that every psychological dynamic involves power, and the man who ignores you is unconsciously attempting to maintain power through withdrawal. In his mind, engagement equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals loss of control. So he chooses the illusion of power through disconnection, not realizing that true strength comes from the courage to be vulnerable. This creates what Jung would recognize as a false power dynamic. He feels powerful because he's withholding something you want: his attention, his emotional presence, his acknowledgement of your worth. You might feel powerless because you're seeking something he refuses to give, but here's the Jungian twist. His need to withhold reveals his weakness, while your courage to remain open reveals your strength. The man who ignores you is actually in the weaker psychological position, even though it might not feel that way. He's operating from fear of his own emotions, fear of losing control, fear of being seen as weak. You're operating from courage, the courage to be authentic, to seek connection, to remain open despite his rejection. Jung taught that psychological maturity involves integrating opposites: strength and vulnerability, independence and connection, masculine and feminine qualities. The man who ignores you is stuck in a one-sided development, rejecting half of human experience. This makes him psychologically incomplete and, ultimately, less powerful than he appears. But here's where your understanding of Jung can transform your experience. Once you recognize his behavior as a symptom of his psychological limitations, rather than a reflection of your worth. You can reclaim your power. You're no longer seeking validation from someone who is fundamentally unable to provide it. Instead, you can make conscious choices about how to respond. Before we dive deeper into your options, I want to remind you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We're uncovering psychological insights that can revolutionize how you understand relationships and human behavior. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss these transformative perspectives. Jung believed that consciousness is power. The more aware you become of the psychological dynamics at play, the more choice you have in how to respond. When you understand that his ignoring behavior stems from his own psychological fragmentation, you can stop dancing to the rhythm of his dysfunction. Your options become clearer. You can choose to engage with someone who is psychologically ready for the kind of connection you offer, or you can accept the limitations of this dynamic and adjust your expectations accordingly. What you cannot do, and what Jung would advise against, is trying to heal his psychological wounds through your own emotional availability. The greatest gift you can give yourself is recognizing that his inability to receive your emotional offerings isn't a problem for you to solve. It's his developmental challenge to face, and it may take years or even decades for him to do the inner work necessary to integrate his rejected aspects. Jung emphasized that we cannot change others, but we can transform our own psychological patterns and responses. When you understand the deep psychological roots of why men ignore you, you gain the power to break free from cycles that drain your energy and diminish your self-worth. The first step is recognizing what Jung called the participation mystique, the unconscious psychological fusion that occurs when you become overly invested in someone else's emotional development. When you find yourself constantly trying to understand, fix, or reach a man who consistently ignores you, you've entered into this unhealthy psychological merger. Jung would ask you to examine your own shadow in this dynamic. What part of you is drawn to emotionally unavailable men? Is there a part of you that feels more comfortable pursuing someone who can't fully receive you than risking genuine intimacy with someone who can? Sometimes, we unconsciously choose people who confirm our deepest fears about our own worthiness. This isn't about blaming yourself. It's about empowering yourself through self-awareness. Jung believed that we often repeat patterns until we become conscious of them. Once you recognize your role in these dynamics, you can make different choices. The man who ignores you is offering you a profound gift, though it doesn't feel like one. He's showing you exactly who he is and what he's capable of offering. Jung taught that people's actions reveal their psychological truth more accurately than their words ever could. When someone consistently ignores your bids for connection, believe them. Your healing doesn't come from getting him to change. It comes from changing your own relationship to his behavior. Instead of seeing his ignoring as a problem to solve, you can see it as information to integrate. He's telling you that he's not psychologically available for the kind of relationship you desire. Jung understood that true intimacy requires two people who have done significant inner work, two people who can meet each other from a place of psychological wholeness rather than neediness or fear. The man who ignores you hasn't done this work, and you can't do it for him. This realization can be initially painful, but ultimately liberating. You can stop waiting for him to develop the emotional capacity he currently lacks. You can stop trying to prove your worth to someone who isn't equipped to recognize it. You can redirect your energy toward relationships with people who are psychologically mature enough to appreciate and reciprocate authentic connection. Jung believed that when we stop trying to force connections that aren't naturally flowing, we create space for relationships that are aligned with our psychological development. The energy you've been pouring into trying to reach an unavailable man can be redirected toward nurturing connections with people who are ready and willing to meet you where you are. As we conclude this deep dive into Jung's insights about men who ignore you, remember that this knowledge is meant to liberate you, not embitter you. Understanding the psychological mechanisms behind dismissive behavior allows you to respond from wisdom rather than wounded emotion. Jung's greatest gift to us was his understanding that every human interaction offers an opportunity for psychological growth. The man who ignores you has inadvertently become your teacher, showing you where you might be giving your power away and where you need to strengthen your own psychological boundaries. The ultimate Jungian perspective on this situation is that his inability to engage authentically with you reveals his own psychological imprisonment. He's trapped in a limited version of masculinity that prevents him from accessing the full spectrum of human experience. While this creates pain for you, it creates even greater suffering for him, the suffering of living a fragmented, incomplete life. Your task is not to rescue him from this psychological prison. Your task is to ensure you don't join him there. Jung believed that we can only help others heal by doing our own inner work and modeling psychological wholeness. When you stop chasing unavailable people and start choosing relationships that nourish your soul, you're not just healing yourself, you're contributing to the collective healing of these dysfunctional patterns. The greatest weakness of a man who ignores you is ultimately his disconnection from his own humanity. He's rejected the very qualities that could make him whole: emotional intelligence, vulnerability, the capacity for deep intimacy. This leaves him psychologically impoverished, even if he appears successful or strong on the surface. Your strength lies in your willingness to remain open to authentic connection, even after experiencing rejection. Your courage to keep showing up emotionally, to keep seeking meaningful relationships, to keep believing in the possibility of genuine intimacy. This is your psychological superpower. Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming your truest self, sometimes requires us to walk away from relationships that keep us small or force us to deny our authentic nature. The man who consistently ignores you is asking you to shrink, to need less, to expect less. Your psychological health requires you to refuse this invitation. As you move forward, carry this Jungian wisdom with you. His behavior is information about his psychological development, not a verdict on your worth. Use this information wisely. Choose relationships with people who can meet you in your fullness. Surround yourself with individuals who celebrate your emotional intelligence rather than fear it. The man who ignores you has revealed his greatest weakness: his inability to recognize and receive the gift of authentic human connection. Don't let his limitation become your prison. Your journey towards psychological wholeness is too important to compromise for someone who isn't ready to join you there. Remember, you deserve relationships that expand you, not ones that require you to contract. Jung would want nothing less for you than the full expression of your psychological potential.